Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me back. So today we're going to continue on with our food farming and justice series as an introduction to the ecosystem of growing food. But before we begin, I have three notes. One is we're going to keep using poll everywhere, so I dropped that link in the chat, but I can drop it again if that's useful. Depending on how many questions we get, because there is a lot of content, I might finish this section next week because I was trying to consider all the things that people wanted to hear about. And I will share last week's and this week's slides with you. Okay, so I just want to review last week a little bit. So we focused on plant life and ecosystems. I gave you a couple definitions. We talked about the factors impacting plant life, and then we talked about plant anatomy so that we can better understand how plants and environment interact with one another. And to set the stage, we spoke about zooming into the food system diagram that I showed in the first week to look at farming and a part of the environmental factors of these systems. And today we're going to expand this focus just a little bit to think about the ways people outlined in this red on the diagram can support ecosystems with which you will interact as growers, community members, and perhaps even livestock raisers if you really like animals. So today's session is about sites as farm or garden ecosystems. And like last week, I'm going to focus on plants, but I'm also going to speak more broadly at first so you can learn some concepts that apply to any site that you wish to cultivate. So to do this, we will first define an ideal site, then look at plant requirements to understand what makes an ideal site. We will also cover some soil basics, then get into how to determine an ideal site. So as you may have noticed, this is different from what I said we would cover last week by a bit. And that's because, like I said earlier, I wanted to incorporate the ideas that you collectively wanted to learn more about while also keeping these lessons as cohesive as possible. So I just want to make sure that you're all on the same page and you're learning the things you want to learn. So with that said, let's get into it. So the ideal site, what does that mean? So I define an ideal site as a site that best facilitates sustained access to the material or other needs of the life within it. So to simplify things, you can think of a site in two ways, relationally and agriculturally. Relationally considers the physical, financial, and social accessibility of a site. So you're asking yourself a lot of questions like, how can people easily get to this site? Can they? Are there hills? If there's public transportation nearby? Is the land affordable? Where is the land located? Is it in a safe space for diverse visitors? Is it in a hostile community? Like, what barriers exist that may impede access? And I include this relational aspect because I'm, again, thinking about the justice aspect of this. So for example, in the position that I have now, working for Black Farmers United, there's this group of people who've created this farm collective, and they're all about like liberation and supporting people. And when they got there, the community made it very clear that they did not want them there. So when you're picking your site and trying to understand, what makes it the best site for what you're trying to do, think about all those social things that are happening, those physical things, those financial things. So agriculturally, this considers the needs of the plants and non-human animals that you hope to care for on the site. But of course, the primary focus of today, like I said earlier, is plants. But to understand what makes an ideal site more specifically, we have to understand what plants need. So as expected, there is a poll everywhere question, and I can drop the link in the chat again. So what do plants need to survive?
So Martha, while the answers come in, I just want to point out there are a couple of people who who are thinking of starting gardens in their places of worship and communities. So I think, you all start thinking about your sites or your schools or things like that while you answer these questions, because it's very important. It's directly relevant to what you could be doing if you started up a project as well, right?
Yeah, so this is going to be very useful for you today, those of you who want to start a garden. And you can definitely ask me more specific questions, like at any point, if you're like, I want to know more about this, like that's fine. I'm okay with moving some of this to next week. So that's good to know. Thank you. All right, so I'm seeing carbon dioxide, phosphate, ooh, nutrients as a whole, air, soil, sunlight, water, compost. Yeah, these are all really great answers and are very accurate. So essentially, plants need 5 things to survive. You can think of them as space, light, nutrients, air, and water. Space, thinking about room for growth and access, like those things I was talking about in the last slide, about ideal sites. Light being this ultimate source of energy that plants in particular will utilize to make their own food. Nutrients, you can think of those as the raw materials that, again, plants are using in combination with light to make their own food. Air, you can think of those as gaseous raw materials because they're going throughout the air, and they're in a gas state. And then there's water, which is acting as a reactant, constituent, and medium. So now 2 of these requirements, nutrients and water, need more of an explanation, I think, for you to better understand sites for gardens and farms. So I'm going to get into that a little. So plants get nutrients from their environment to make their own food and carry out various functions. And scientists have determined that plants need at least 18 different elements to survive. And these in their various forms are called essential nutrients, or you can call them essential elements, depending on who you ask or what makes more sense to you, but they are synonymous. These nutrients can be divided into 2 large categories, macronutrients and micronutrients. Like I said a little bit the last week I was speaking with all of you, macronutrients are those elements that are used in large quantities by plants. You can further break those down even into 3 additional subcategories. There are structural. These are the elements utilized, as the name suggests, in the plant structure. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are structural elements, and these are mostly obtained by the plant through air. So if you're thinking about carbon and sometimes oxygen, but really that more so comes from water, which is the hydrogen and oxygen. Then there are primary macronutrients, and these are elements that are in very high demand in a plant and for a variety of different plant processes. And that's why they are most commonly deficient when a plant is struggling for nutrients and is deficient in something. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or NPK, which you'll most likely hear it as most often, are primary elements or nutrients. But a fun fact that I actually looked up, because it's been a while since I've been in a chemistry class, or like a high school chemistry class, I should say. So the elements are actually based on original Latin names, and maybe you knew this already, but this is why the K is the symbol for potassium. So in Latin, potassium is kalium, which is very interesting. And I have a link to a source from the National Library of Congress if you are interested in knowing the origin of words, so etymology. I thought it was fascinating. But anyway, also with macronutrients, they are secondary, that's the last category. Compared to the primary elements, these are in lesser demand, but they're also, of course, very important, and that would be calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Then there are the micronutrients, and these are elements used in comparatively less quantities by quite a bit, and they include iron, chlorine, zinc, cobalt, nickel, magnesium, manganese, excuse me, molybdenum, copper, and boron. Okay, so what are all of these nutrients doing? All of them have very specific roles and they take on multiple roles. But for the structural elements that are of the macronutrients, you have, again, that's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they're the main parts of a plant structure or skeleton, and they're serving as the source of energy for plant metabolism. So that concept of plants making their own food from those raw materials, It's usually in the form of carbohydrates, which include sugars, starches, and cellulose, which is really used as that structural part of plants. So like the stem it has cellulose within it. Then there's energy, so that would be nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So their major roles are in storing energy and facilitating transfers of energy. So if you remembering back to chemistry, or if you're in chemistry now, that if you're thinking about examples, so there's NADH or NADPH and ATP and all of those energy molecules, like that's why those are as significant as they are, because without them, the plant can't break those bonds and get energy from it. And sulfur isn't the within the enzymes and coenzymes. Then there's charge balance. So there's the potassium, calcium, and magnesium. So it's actually that balancing of charges of ions and molecules, and the presence of some will impact others. And I remember saying that a little bit last week. And the last thing that generally these essential nutrients are doing is impacting enzymes as well as electron transport. So again, thinking about that concept of like photosynthesis and respiration, and all of those processes are involving iron, manganese, copper, zinc, molybdenum, boron, and chlorine, and they're involved more specifically in enzyme activation, or like I said, electron transport. So if you were paying attention and remember these essential nutrients from something else you learned before, there are two elements missing here. That's cobalt and nickel. And that's because cobalt is used in plant growth, such as stem elongation. So that's like its own separate category in a way. And nickel is really just important within seeds, but not as the plant matures and becomes a seedling and then a mature plant, an adult plant, if you will.
And Martha, just one thing I would point out here, and I think you can speak to it as well, right? That is, I think it's important to think about this very carefully when we think about what we are taking out of the plant. Like, so if we are harvesting just the fruit or we are harvesting just the root, because that gives you also a sense of what you need to replace in the next cycle, correct? What gets lost in the land and what you need to replace. That's why this arcane chemistry is extremely useful, right?
Absolutely, and I will speak to it a little bit about how you can test those things and notice like when those changes are happening, because you can't always see them. Great point, thank you. Any questions about this before I keep going? Because I know it's a lot of information. Okay, well, if you have any, you can drop it in the chat and I'll try to answer it as we go. So oftentimes all of these nutrients are interacting with water, which serves a variety of functions in a plant. So some of those really important critical functions are acting as a constituent or reactant within chemical processes. So thinking about like, again, photosynthesis and respiration and all the other different things that are happening within a plant. And they're also involved in, water is also involved in hydrolytic processes. So that concept of breaking water bonds, or using water to break bonds, that energy that's released. It's also a solvent, water, and a medium for chemical reactions. And again, thinking about chemistry, solvents are important because they can impact the rate of reactions, the solute stability, that's the thing dissolving within a solvent, and then solubility itself, like how well something can dissolve in water, and plants utilize those interactions all the time to help a plant, get something into or out of it, or to protect it from something. Water also acts as a medium for solute transportation. So remember, we talked a lot about xylem and phloem, so that concept of as water is flowing up due to those hydrostatic forces, it's carrying with it a bunch of nutrients, or even when it's in the soil, and that concept of mass flow that I talked about last time, where as water is trying to go from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, which is usually near the roots because the plant's actively taking up that water, a lot of nutrients will come with that. Water is also acting as a medium for turgor pressure, and I know someone used that term last week when we were thinking about understanding hydrostatic pressures better. So essentially the water is flowing into a cell and it makes it larger, It helps keep a plant upright, so when it's dehydrated and the plant's like slumping over, it's because that water is being used in cells to keep it upright. And also is helping with leaf display, so it helps a leaf like open itself up or close itself on its own. So it might intentionally look like it's like dehydrating itself, but it might be doing that to keep a lot of light away from it if it's, if it has that capability and there's too much. So water is important in that sense as well. And it's also, like I said last week, a medium for facilitating cooling. So that concept of opening the stomata, letting the water out, and then the light energy exciting the water molecules and making that a gas as opposed to burning what's happening inside the plant itself. Okay. So now that we have some idea of features that make an ideal site, well, at least ones that talk about the basic necessities, we have sun, there's air, there's water, there's nutrients, there's plenty of space everywhere. But is this everything? Is there anything that you can think of that's maybe missing from this image or wrong with this image or this site? Another poll everywhere question. Helium. It's not one that's really necessary for a plant. Well, the water would be the blue as well as water breaking apart because like the hydroxide and hydrogen molecules. Oxygen is missing from this picture for sure. No one's thinking really basic. Well, nitrogen is in the form of nitrate in this particular photo. Because you won't actually see like individual elements just floating about all the time. Like hydrogen would be one of those exceptions, calcium, for example. So a lot of times you might see nutrients in the form of compounds. So there'd be like nitrate, and someone said phosphate, and or potash really is where you're seeing a lot of nutrients in the form of nitrogen. Seeds, plants, okay. Well, we're thinking about the site as a facilitator for that plant life. So I think I'll just tell you. I'm talking about soil. Although it's not essential for plant growth, soil is often the medium in which people decide to grow plants, especially if we're talking about outdoors in your garden. And as such, it is really important to understand soil, including its functions, how it forms, and its composition. So I'm just going to get into that a bit so that it makes more sense when we're talking about the soil tests and the nutrients and how all of that makes sense, how that comes together. So first I want to talk a bit about the ecological functions of soil, because again, everything is operating in an ecosystem, and it does so many different things. So it's a medium for plant growth, which is the most obvious here. Water and nutrients, so there's that rhizosphere. I think I used that term before, but essentially that's this interface between like the plant's roots and the soil itself. It provides anchorage, so if roots are like gripping onto that soil so the plant doesn't tip over. Ventilation, thinking about gases, actually regulating temperature and providing some type of protection for plants. It's a habitat for other soil organisms, so you could think of like large ones like worms and other insects that you'll see, but it's also a microbiome. So if you're thinking about different little organisms like mycorrhizae, which is a fungus that I talked about last week a little bit, rhizobia, I think that's a bacteria species. It's also an engineering medium. So if you're thinking about having like a house and you want to make the soil really tight or compact, so it's a strong basis upon which people can build structures. It's also a system for water supply and purification. So there are actual, like, maybe some of you have like a septic tank. So there's like a septic drain fields. It's a natural filtering system itself because different particles may attach to soil, which I'll talk about more, and then help get you cleaner water. There are like whole systems that are based on trying to filter water using soil. It's a recycling system for nutrients. If you're thinking about different cycles or thinking about waste products that are decaying and how those like fungus might feed on those things, but leaves are decaying. And then it's a modifier of the atmosphere, again, thinking about those cycles again of like carbon dioxide and methane and oxygen and nitrogen, carbon cycles. And it's also re-radiating energy. So there might be a lot of sun that comes down and it might radiate that energy back. So it's doing a lot of different things. But again, we're going to focus in on plants. But what is soil exactly? But first we need to think about the soil forming factors to understand how soil comes to be. So first and foremost, there is an underlying bedrock, or known as a parent material. So that will weather away due to climate, so temperature, precipitation, wind, moisture is just breaking apart those rocks, and that eventually becomes fine enough to look like the soil that we think of. Topography, if there's differing slopes, like you see in this image, there's like a sloped rock there. That also helps with weathering. Biological factors, so there might be plants growing on there or different animals like decaying or gnawing away at it, and that's going to impact what the soil becomes. And then there's also just time, over time, things are constantly changing, so what it was before might be different. Maybe it's a smaller size particle than it was before, but it's always essentially going to become a part, like is forming from that parent material. So you might want to add in a bunch of other soil, but as that soil withers, it's going to again revert back to that parent material, because that's what that bedrock is. You're not going to get rid of that. So what is the composition of soil? So all soil, ideally for plants, has 3 layers. There's an air layer, so we're again thinking about like oxygen, and carbon dioxide is actually within the roots, like in the soil itself too. Water, which I mean can go back and forth between like water and air, so it's really pore space. So that's also, the water layer is also known as an aqueous layer. And then there's minerals and organic matter, and that's known as a solid layer. And the percentages that you see here can be greater or lower. Yet generally speaking, variations in these percentages can cause issues for a plant inhabiting the soil. Like if there's way too much water, it's become waterlogged, and now the plant can't get any, like the roots can't get any oxygen because it is alive, so they are breathing in a way. If there isn't enough organic matter for certain plants, then it's deficient maybe in some nutrients. There's too much mineral, there's not enough pore space at all, then there's not enough room for the roots to even move through the soil in the first place. But with that being said, every plant needs something different. So maybe one needs like 50% minerals, mineral content, and maybe no organic matter, or just 1% organic matter. So these are the ideal, just generally speaking, about all the plants you can think of, but it does vary because every plant is different. So the next thing is soil architecture. I'm not going to talk about all the things that make up soil architecture because they're simply not necessary to talk about for your purposes. So these factors are describing soil. So texture, thinking what size are these soil particles, thinking about, again, what pore space might exist because of that texture. Structure is literally the shape of soil, so they're like soil blocks, and again, not really important for our purposes, so I won't get into that. There's color, which can reveal the mineral, ion, or organic composition of the soil, as it can suggest water content and affects radiation and absorption, is thinking about different colors reflecting different amounts of light. And all of these things are impacted by the soil forming factors that I spoke to in the last slide. And you can identify all of these characteristics using soil tests, which I'll get into later. But right now, I just want to cover a little bit in more detail, texture and color. But are there any other questions before I do that? Okay. So again, soil texture is the size of particles, which can fall into four categories. Gravel, which is just the largest, and it can go up as high essentially as you want it until it's, you consider it a rock if you want. There's sand, which is below that. If you're looking at this image on the left, this diagram, there's silt, which would be the next size, and then clay, if you're thinking about the scale, is so tiny, tiny, tiny that you can't even see it here. So that's the smallest one. And texture is influencing how well water can move throughout the soil and how well soil can retain water and its accompanying nutrients, which are often attained by the plant as ions, which is why in the image that I showed of the site, there was there were all these little ions that were floating around in the water because that's often how plants are obtaining those nutrients. But this connects back to something I was talking about last week when I was mentioning ions and roots. So here we have the root here that's like represented by these like blocks that are cells, and it's in this soil, which are these brown circular pieces. And then next to that are the particles that I was talking about. But if we're thinking about how that looks when they're interacting, there's this image all the way to on the rightmost of the slide. And a lot of times the particles, like we're thinking about clay, for example, of soil are negative. So it will better attract or cling more intensely to other positive ions that are in there. So like potassium and hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, those are the plant nutrients. So you keep in mind that as soil size, particle size decreases as it's weathered, it also is increasing surface area as the size is getting smaller. And this means that clay, for example, that really tiny particles is going to be able to hold more tightly onto plant nutrients. And that is one of like so many different reasons why it is so difficult to grow many plants in heavy clay soils. And I will come back to that point. But I just wanted you to conceptualize like how what we were talking about with nutrients is so relevant to the soil. The last thing I want to say about this is that you can use two easy tests to determine soil texture. Soil texture, so it's texture by feel, and there's something called the jar test that I will talk about. But for now, I just want to get into color. That's the last thing I'm going to talk about with soils that I feel is really relevant. So to reiterate, soil color can reveal a lot about soil in terms of the water status of it and its nutrient content. So thinking about iron being very abundant on Earth which is a micronutrient for plants. If you're seeing a lot of red, yellows, and browns, it's usually an oxidized form of iron. So if you're thinking iron with like a +3, which means that it has like a more positive charge. Then there's reduced iron. If there's a lot of that, sometimes the soil will be very gray and even a little green. So it tells you a little bit about these different forms of iron that are necessary for the plant. And this, I mean, is true, but there's so many other things interacting with it. If the soil is black, it can mean that there isn't very much iron within it. And you can use something called the Munsell color system to figure out like what color is the soil and what does that mean to me and why should I care about that? Right. Any questions about any of that? I know it's a lot to take in, so. Okay. So when we look at our site, we still have the sun, we still have air and water and nutrients, but now we also have soil. And there are still so many considerations to a site. You can't just have air and sun, some nutrients in the soil, some water, and then we're good. So I'm wondering, if you're thinking about it, what else might we consider when we're trying to find an ideal site or determine its suitability? What factors are we not thinking about? Oh, haven't we talked about yet? Yeah, you're all naming really great factors that we do need to consider. A lot of the things are related to climate as that bigger umbrella. pH is the first time I'm seeing that one. Um, yeah, so we're going to consider all of those things, but to learn about each of these things, we conduct a site assessment. So that's where that term and that's what that process is about. And that's just a set of tests and observations to determine the viability of a site or like a farm or a garden, another way of looking at it. So those considerations are microclimate if we're thinking more specifically about what we're talking about for that specific site. So that's including precipitation, um, sun exposure, windiness, temperature, related to those things, humidity, like someone was saying. And then there's the space itself. So what's happening with the soil? Is it accessible, like I talked about towards the beginning? What resources are available? What is the size of the site? This is when we start thinking about tests as well. But first, I want to start with some observations. So when I say space, I'm referring to a site's functionality and its ecological and social context. And when I say that, I mean we're thinking about how those things are interacting the potential, or impacting the site's potential to become an ideal site, like we were talking about earlier. So one of the most important first steps that you can take is to consider like the who in that space already. And I'm talking about more than people. And when I say who, so you're conducting a survey of sorts where you're asking yourself and the people around are familiar with that site some basic questions like what other animals and plants live there? Maybe someone has been very observant and knows that. Who utilizes that space? Who is around that space often? Do they live nearby or on the site itself? Thinking about like plants, animals, people who may be there. Um, and you want to make note of all of that and think about how your intentions for that space may disrupt who is there and whether you find those disruptions okay. Maybe it means that people won't have the ability to just walk around as freely or play soccer on a field, but maybe there's something you can talk about with someone to see like an alternative space for them, or maybe this isn't the right space for you. Um, and then reviewing what I said a bit earlier, thinking about accessibility in your assessment of the space, you think to yourself a lot of more questions that you can ask. Is the site in a location where people can easily get to it using personal or public transportation? Is it in an area that is socially welcoming, at least enough not to pose a significant barrier to the people for whom the space will be designed? Then there's traversability, or thinking about it in terms of people who can walkability. So how well can people walk to the site? Does it have physical features that impede movement for people with physical disabilities? For example, can someone in a wheelchair or on a cane or in crutches easily navigate that site? Can someone with a stroller navigate that site? And if it is not accessible, is there anything that you can reasonably do to change it to make it more traversable and socially acceptable? And when I say reasonably, I'm thinking about, the funding that you might have to make those changes to the land. And then if you make those changes, what existing life that you observed will change, and will it harm them or will it be better? And same thing with the social ecosystems that are there. And then thinking about rules about things, do you have the consent of a municipality, so like a city or a town, to alter that site in the first place? And can you build positive relationships with the people so that you can do those things, and that it doesn't matter if you make these changes because everyone's on board for it. Um, then there are things that are like solely physical to consider about the site. Thinking about, is it literally large enough for your project? Is it too large? Is there like too much space where you're like, I don't know how to maintain all of this space? Then you got to think about water availability. So is there enough water for the plants and people and animals for on that site? Can you wash your hands and wash out your eyes and wash other items, like you're trying to clean off like your seating trays, for example, you might want to do. And I mentioned specifically eyes because you may need to like flush out a debris or chemical. And even if you're working with something um, organic, you still don't necessarily want that in your eye. You don't want it touching your skin necessarily. So you got to think about all of those things when you're trying to pick a site. And then lastly, there are the things that are both physical and social, like this establishing or erecting a structure on a site. So you might want to build a permanent storage shed, for example. A lot of people who want to start a community garden that's owned by a city, or even like cooperative extension, like I'm thinking about the one in Nassau County at East Meadow Farm. If you want to, that's like owned by the state. If you want to build a structure on it, you might have to consult again the town about it. So you may not have the zoning permissions to build something on there. It's like, well, we don't allow you to build structures on that. So you got to think about that too when you're picking a site. Because if you want to have storage on there because it's not reasonable to carry your tools back and forth, or because it's just so much of a large site, you have to think about that. And then it might just be so small that you can't fit a tool shed on there without taking up valuable space for the purpose that you want it to use it for. Like it's not enough space to raise chickens. So like the site doesn't make any sense anymore. So essentially what I'm trying to get at with all of these different parts is that you need to do your homework. You get to know all the elements of your site, talk to the people, and really like start building a relationship with that site itself and the community around it or that's interacting with it. Any questions about that? Okay. So the next thing, and I talked about site assessments, was the microclimate. But before we talk about microclimate, like what is even a climate? So that is essentially the long-term weather patterns of an area or regions. There's a climate system that's thinking about land surface, so that's the soils and topography. So topography, again, being that whether it has a slope or not and to what extent. The cryosphere, so thinking about ice water essentially, that's usually pretty deep down in the soil. The atmosphere, so again, the gaseous layers, the hydrosphere, the liquid layers, the biosphere, all the living things interacting in that space, in that climate system. And then there, of course, are ways to measure different parts of the climate to get a bigger picture of what that is. So there's quantifiable things like temperature, precipitation, like how windy is it? How often is it that windy? Like what's the fastest the wind's going? Humidity, which someone had mentioned, cloud cover, the atmospheric pressure, elevation. So I was talking about that as well. Like what altitude are you at? Because that changes things as well. Then there are, of course, if you remember from science class, like classifications. So there's tropical, it could be dry, it could be mild, continental, polar. You can think about it being a high elevation, which is the original classifications were by one person, and high elevation is something that was later added on in terms of thinking about science and the history of those classifications. But New York State is continental, basically, so if you're thinking about that larger climate. But I mean, within that, there can be so many additional smaller differences within an area. Like where I am at near Rochester is definitely very different climate-wise, microclimate-wise, than where you are somewhere on Long Island, or even in like New York City. It's like a totally different climate there. So essentially, a microclimate is that variation within a larger climate within that region, thinking again about New York State, for example. The topography might be different. There might be different vegetation as well, which doesn't necessarily fit into topography. There might be different bodies of water and human built structures that are there that are influencing things. And speaking of that, there's like the urban heat island effect. So I was talking about how in New York City, that's like a totally different microclimate. There are actually some parts of it that are now considered tropical. So basically, with the urban heat island effect, a city area is usually warmer than the surrounding areas because there are all these large buildings and there's lots of heat radiating. There are actually physical bodies radiating heat, but it's more because of all those structures that are there. And then you usually have blacktop, so or concrete, and those things aren't really absorbing radiation and dissipating it, more evenly. It's like you're getting all of this heat, it's holding on to it, it might radiates out slowly, and then it's just really hot in a city. And then there's something called a lake effect, where there are really cold winds blowing over a relatively warm lake, which cause the rapid cloud formation and lots of precipitation. So near certain lakes or bodies of water, you might have that effect. So now there's a lot more precipitation in that area, which is why microclimate is so important. And if we're thinking about temperature, there is the USDA hardiness zones, which is a tool that I will show you. I'll show you after these slides, which we're measuring the average temperature of an area. So there are lots of plants that might be well suited for an area that has like 6B, for example, and that's like an average set of ranges, temperature ranges, which again, you can look up, and Long Island in particular is like 7A to 7B of those 13 zones. So if you're wondering like, can I grow, a lemon tree? Well, is that suitable? I mean, this is again thinking very basically only about one thing, temperature. And if you were to look at the hardiness zone, like it's a much lower zone. So the answer to that is really no, there's not a long enough growing season. So there are lots of measurements that you can take here. You can take temperature to define a microclimate, like I was just saying, windiness, relative humidity, light intensity, and other different types of measurements to quantify those very predictable, but also just like complicated factors impacting the site. So we covered all of these considerations between last week and this week. I talked about them, each of them to a certain extent. But now we're going to look at how we measure them and what those tools look like in practice. So this again is going to be even more information, and it might feel overwhelming, but again, I'm going to share all these slides with you. So I'm not looking for you to like know any of this for the quiz, or I just want you to know what's out there so that you can use these tools when you're thinking about your own site. So for example, with temperature, I was talking about the USDA plant hardiness zone map. So it usually does it by color. And if you see to the right, there are these different ranges of temperature. And I was saying that Long Island, if you see here, that greener color is like 7A, 7B. And it helps, again, you to identify what plants you're able to see. And if you're noticing it's going across almost the entirety of the continental US, and that's because it's usually impacted by latitude. So you're thinking about how the sun is hitting those areas, or how when you're getting closer to the equator, it's warmer because the sun is there and more intense in those areas. So that's a really great way to know, to I guess eliminate a factor when you're thinking about, okay, I want to grow this thing. And the easiest way I can think about it is going straight to this map. So can I grow this outside easily? Okay, no. And then you might want to think about all the other factors going on. Another thing that you can use for temperature, in addition to that hardiness zone map, which is based again on averages over a long period of time, is growing degree days. This is something that I wish people used more, and I wish there were like more resources for it, because I want to use it more, but it's a little more difficult thinking about each plant's requirements. So growing degree days is thinking about how much has it been above or below a certain temperature for a plant. So if we're thinking about you're growing corn, for example, and it's like, oh, we've had a lot of days that have been above like 70 degrees, and that's something that's necessary to impact plant development, because plants may mature slower or faster, or maybe just not at all based on the temperature. So it may be, May, and it's supposed to be a certain temperature, and the plant that I started as seedlings indoors in March is supposed to be a certain height, it's supposed to be developed to a certain point, but it hasn't. And it's like, well, why hasn't it? You can check this calculator and see like, well, has it been enough? Have there been enough days above this temperature that help trigger that next developmental phase so that my plant can grow by the time I want it to? So this is a tool that you're using to really predict when, like as you're actively growing, something is going to be able to grow to a certain level of development by the time you want it to. So if you're growing corn, like, will my corn be ready by this date? And if not, is there anything I can do about it? Probably not, but at least you can know and use this information for the next time, or just have a better way to adjust your plan for what you were expecting to have grown there. So that's another one you can use. And it's a little more complicated to understand, but it's a really great tool if you want to get more specific. Okay, then there's precipitation, one of those things we were talking about for climate or microclimate. So the National Weather Service has a prediction map or tool that you can use that talks about precipitation. And there's so many other different things you can look at, like air quality. I know I just use this for precipitation. So that's another thing you can look at to see, like, am I going to get enough rain? Should I be watering my plants? Should I turn off the irrigation that I might have because it's going to be like a very rainy day? Is there going to be like a lot of rain this season? Um, so that's one way to use that tool if you want to go online again. But you could also make a rain gauge, which is really just looking at all the cumulative water that has been there over time. So that's something that you can build on your own. This is like a really large one that a scientist built to just like try to remember how well or easy or really hard it was to build a rain gauge. So all of these again are approximations because we can make very large general predictions and maybe get even finer predictions based on certain tools and how that technology becomes more sophisticated. But it's also just very difficult to do. So you're just trying to give yourself as much information about it as possible to make the best decisions about the things that you're growing. Okay, the next thing is sun exposure. So you might hear that a plant really likes shade or partial shade and partial sun, and like, what do any of those terms mean? So they're basically just talking about how much sun you're getting and like in terms of hours throughout a day. So you might have a site that's getting, well, let's just say sunny, not shade up there. That's a mistake. The first one. So if it's getting like 6+ hours a day, you're getting a lot of sun. So exposure is considering the light based on sun angles. So you're thinking about the compass direction. So you might hear the term solar south, which is not always the same as like magnetic south. So there is a way of determining that. Again, you can go online and use those types of tools. You can also, if you're thinking about like, well, how many hours in a day am I getting certain, how many hours of a day is this particular part of the site getting, this much is getting sun. You can go out every day and like think about and like look at an area or look or stand from the same point and just mark like, okay, you can do this every hour, every 2 hours, and be like, okay, at 8 a.m. this time there is still sun on it. At 8 a.m. the next day there is no sun on it, and you just get a better feel for what's happening in that site over time. I mean, that's a really complicated, I wouldn't say complicated, but just a very time-consuming way of trying to determine how much sun an area is getting. So I normally like to just do like solar south versus like, is it east, is it west? And then maybe you go out 3 times during the day, but it's good to know how much sun things are going to get. Something like tomatoes that needs a lot of sun. If you're going to put it in an area thinking like, oh, it's sunny right now at 12 p.m., but then most of the day it's shady, then you're not going to give that plant enough sun, and now your tomato plants are dying. You're like, why is it dying? It could be because you didn't put it in the right area. So you don't want to waste your resources and harm a plant or anything else because you didn't make those observations. Okay, any questions about that? Because now I'm about to get into soil, and there are so many soil tests and so many things you can look at. Okay. Okay. Then there are soils. This particular diagram or chart is coming from the Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health, the Cornell framework. That's actually a resource that you can download on Cornell University's site. I can drop the link to it in the chat, or I can send all the links to all these different tools later. But as you can see here, there's so many things that you can test for or pay attention to with soil because it's such a complicated ecosystem that's supporting plant life or sometimes harming it. So thinking like chemical, thinking about all those different nutrients, you're thinking about how much salt is in there, cation exchange capacity, which is basically like how well can, those negative soil particles let go of other of those positive nutrients that you need, like potassium, like we were talking about. You can think about how many heavy metals are in there, and heavy metals that would be harmful to humans who are trying to use this soil to grow something that's edible. There's pH, there's all these different things happening chemically. Biologically, it's thinking about like, you know, how well are things decomposing, how much organic matter is in there, like how many like specific types of organisms are in there, like nematodes, are there pathogens in there? So again, it goes on and on. How many seeds are in there that are weeds that may interrupt like how well the plants that you want are growing in there. Then there's physical things. We talked about texture, bulk density, which is just a ratio. Porosity, how well can water be held? So there's just all these things, but I just want to show you some basic ones that I use pretty often and I feel like go a long way, especially if you're just starting out in a site. It doesn't have to be super complicated. And even within this list, I'm only going to cover just like a few. I know we don't have a lot of time left right now, but I just want you to be able to know about them and have a basic idea. And then really getting to know how to use the soil tests are all about practice. You get a feel for it. So there's texture, which again is about the size of particles, which has like a really big impact. It's not the only thing important, but it is pretty significant. You can do texture by feel, or you can do a jar test. Water movement, so how well can water get to your plants? How well is it getting into the soil in the first place? Is it really tightly compacted, the soil? So can your roots move through the soil at all? What is the pH? Because that's going to impact nutrient content, but you could also measure exactly how many nutrients are really in there in the first place. Not exactly, but more accurately, seeing like how much nitrogen's in the soil. You can think about biological, because if there's a lot of microbiome activity that's positive, then that can help, you know, that those symbiotic relationships that might be happening between the plant and like the fungus I was talking about. And then there might just be like general information, like those digital tools I was talking about, because there are even more for soil. So one, if you just want to know like the basics of a site and you don't want to sit there and do a bunch of tests, which I think that you should do like at least a couple of them or send something away to a lab to test it, you can just look at the general type of soil within an area. So the government, the USDA, has done soil surveys or have like commissioned projects to do that. So they'll tell you like in Long Island, there might be, you know, we're thinking about like the northern part of Long Island, there might be a lot of like sandy loam there. So it'll tell you like very generally, this is the type of soil that you have there. So again, if you want to look up like, can I grow, you know, blueberries here? You know, what type of soil does it need? Which is something that's well researched. So you can just say, oh, okay, so based on like this general area, which you can actually zoom into an area and look at all the different types of soils that are there, you can say, okay, I can probably grow that here. That's like a way to do it, but it's best used just to know like very basic like general information about an area, because again, there's microclimates, there are things that are very different about your particular site, but that's a tool that you want and you can play around with it and see how useful you do or do not find it. Texture by feel. I really like this one, but if you don't like touching soil, then you probably don't want to do this one. But essentially, you take a little bit of soil, put it in your palm, you're like putting water in it, and you're trying to form a ribbon, which is in that second photo. And the ribbon is telling you like how long, like how based on how long it is, it's telling you what type of particles are in there. Because like I said, the smaller ones want to stick together. So if it's like a really long ribbon, it might be clay. And then you're looking at the grittiness, like is there a lot of sand particles in there when I feel it? So this one definitely takes a lot of practice, and eventually you just do it and it makes sense. But if you feel like I don't want to touch soil, I don't want to figure out how to use soil, what the texture is by touching it, you can do a jar test. And very basically what this is you're taking soil from like about a foot down, because that's more representative of what the plant will be experiencing, thinking about how far down the roots go. You're putting water in there, you're shaking it up, then you're letting it sit, and the sediments that form first will be like your largest sediments, and then at the very top that would be the clay. Overall, this takes like about a day and like 2 days and like a few hours to do. So you're just measuring stuff, and then you're seeing the percentages of each of those things, And then there's this pyramid here where you'll look at the lines going from the bottom up would be the sand. The ones going across are the clay, and the ones going down on the right side of this triangle will tell you silt. And then you're just like, you take two of those and then you're just seeing where the lines meet each other. And then it tells you, oh, that's clay soil, that's loam soil. And again, that's a way of determining more specifically for your site, like what type of soil you have and like what you can or cannot grow there, instead of trying to figure out by trial and error. I know we're basically out of time, but there's pH kits. You can do lab tests where people do basically all the work for you of determining like what your soil is like. But that's more expensive. It's like, if I'm not mistaken, like over $100 or something. But I think it's worth it to do it if you want to, you know, have a farm or a garden long term. There's pH that you can do yourself, again, if you really like to use soil or you just don't have a lot of tools. So there's different websites and resources, like there's Washington State there. I think that's your extension office that had created this. So you're just using baking soda and distilled water and vinegar in the soil to determine like if it's bubbling with vinegar, since that vinegar is acidic, it's basic. So you're thinking about how those things are interacting. You're thinking about chemical reactions, and it's telling you very basically whether it's falling below 7, which is neutral, so that's acidic if it's below 7, or above 7, and that's basic. So that's another way to do it. There's water flow, so you're like digging a hole and seeing how fast the water goes down. So that's how fast the water is moving through the soil. You could have soil and you're putting a column on top of it and then seeing how fast the water goes down. So that's infiltration. So how well the soil is going, water is going through the top of the soil, like just getting into it in the first place, which is thinking about compaction. Compaction, which is, you know, if there isn't a lot of pore space and it's really just minerals that are really tightly held together, roots can only apply so much pressure to reach those different parts of the soil. So if it's about above like 300 psi, which is just a measurement for pressure, for example, like you're not going to be able to grow anything there. Like the roots can't get anywhere. So that tool is just a penetrometer to the left, and those are pretty expensive as well, but once you have one, you can use it, you know, forever if you want. So that's everything. Like I said, I know that was a lot of information, but I know I'm going to take these slides and give them to you so you can look through all of them and have questions and ask those of me. I know you probably don't want to say to ask me more questions, but I'll give you that space to do that because I can stay a little bit longer. But next time I'm going to talk about like, what do you do with all of this data once you've assessed the site? What are those growing practices, which is something that people really wanted to know a lot about. Despite how well you do those growing practices, you know, life is happening. So what problems do you have with those plants? And how can you get, you know, fix those problems to the best of your ability? Identifying some plants, and then if you want to know even more information, like how you can even access that information in the first place.